Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Content Matters podcast. Today, we have Amber Swope with us. Amber is an internationally recognized information architect, a DITA expert, and I can tell you what DITA stands for, but if you're listening, I hope you know anyway, and an information architecture consultant. She has over 20 years of information development experience and 15 years of DITA experience. And she specializes in helping organizations create opportunities through AI. And one of the things that I think is really exciting that Amber does is she helps teams build scalable AI solutions. I keep saying AI, don't I? I just realized
They go hand in hand.
she is an IA consultant, information architecture consultant, and she builds scalable IA solutions that future enable content and empowers team members to advance their architecture, all in the event of helping their businesses move forward and be successful. So thank you, Amber. And I'm so sorry I said AI instead of IA. There's my brain going, right?
It happens all the time. So first of all, thank you for having me.
Yeah.
And because we've gone there, with the advent of AI, a lot of folks are saying, well, what do we even need AI? And so one of the things I want to make sure that we do touch on in this talk is how those two items go hand in hand.
Yep, definitely. Very important to kind of cover that off as well. So let's kind of get started and kind of get the basics out of the way, which is how are you defining information architecture and what are some of the biggest misconceptions you see about information architecture in organizations, especially around their technical content?
Yeah, well, that's a great place because like many terms, the phrase information architecture can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And so I like to define information architecture as the art and science of organizing information that is findable, manageable, and useful. And this is a quote from, and you can find it like references on my website, Stiglish. And I really like that because it's the art and the science. So there is definitely a set of principles that we would use for architecture, but if you give the same challenge to 4 or 5 different information architects, maybe 80% of it would be the same, but that 20% would all be slightly different based upon our interpretation, our experience, our ability to bring together disparate techniques into the architecture. And so to me, that's really important to recognize that you want it to be as consistent as possible, but there also needs to be that flexibility, and that flexibility also extends to the design.
Yeah, it's do you think that a lot of organizations don't appreciate the work that goes into it?
Oh, undoubtedly. And that goes to the what are the common misconceptions? The first is that organizations think they don't have architecture. And that's not the case. They just haven't named it. If you look at a body of content, and let's say that it's a traditional tech hubs group, and you go to their portal and they have user guides, administration guides, getting started, release notes. Those are deliverables. They all have structure within them. That structure, if it isn't consistent, is a reflection of their architecture. And when I talk to groups of folks live, I'll say, oh, how many of you are information architects? And a few people will raise their hand. And then I ask, do you control the organization of the content as it appears in a deliverable, such as the table of contents? Most folks raise their hand. They don't think of themselves as doing architecture, but that's what they're doing. Because if they go back to the definition, findable, useful, that is how people access the information, and that is all part of architecture. So that first misconception, you don't have it. No, you just haven't named it. You haven't recognized it, and therefore it's not a discipline that really can serve your business. And the second one that I think is folks have at their own risk is that it's not important. And this is, the reason this is to me a huge misconception is that if you want consistency, it starts with architecture. A lot of folks start with their style guide, and again, consistency of the words is important, but the consistency of the structure is foundational. And they don't recognize that importance and how that contributes to findability For instance, if you go to a web portal and you're looking for information, if things are not, structured the same, if they don't have the same metadata, it's a terrible user experience. And that idea that you don't need it is where you start seeing the impacts on the business in terms of increased technical support calls or low UX scores on the website or any of those lower adoption rates of a product. That all can be traced back a lot of times because they haven't given enough attention to their architecture. And lastly, that it's static. For the folks who do say, yes, we have it, yes, it's important, they sometimes stumble on the third piece, which is, oh, well, we did our DITA architecture in case of DITA or just any architecture. We did it when we first implemented such tools or, DITA or, if you're in DocBook, the architecture. That could be 5 years ago. Has the business that you're supporting changed in 5 years? Have the people that you're supporting changed? Probably. If not, you're probably not in business if it's been 5 years.
Yeah.
And so the idea that the architecture that you put together 5 years ago is going to fit what you're trying to do now, and even more importantly, in the future to serve your business, that's a misconception. And I really encourage folks to if they haven't looked at their architecture recently, to do an assessment and say, oh, does this serve us? Do we have the right level of granularity? And particularly with the advent of AI and how they're utilizing AI, are there opportunities that they could be serving with their architecture and some enhancements, or even in some cases, some streamlining of their architecture that they should be looking for? And that's where a lot of times with these, for instance, these AI initiatives, they'll come back and say, okay, what are the architectural types that we can be aware of? Because certain of them might be more appropriate for inclusion in the training set or even the source information from which, for instance, a chatbot might pull than others. And there might be some that you totally want to exclude. Yeah. The architecture can serve that, but only if it's been maintained and kept in alignment with the ever-evolving business needs that the company or the organization may have, as well as your users.
Yeah. And so companies that don't kind of have that discipline of creating that architecture and managing it on an ongoing basis are probably struggling today with their AI.
Yeah, and part of it is that there's not been an easy way to maintain it, and a lot of folks feel that it can feel like the architectural exercise is divorced or separated from the implementation of it. And that's one of the areas where I've been doing a lot of work, is to say, okay, we know how important it is. How can we make it fundamentally more integrated into these other systems so that it doesn't feel like extra work? The other challenge, quite honestly, is, and I've seen this happen, is that somebody will be there, they'll be in the role of an information architect. And I say role, it's not always a full-time position. Your group might not need that type of support. And quite candidly, a lot of times in smaller groups that are in less structured content, the person who serves that role might just be their editor.
Right.
Because the person who creates their authoring templates, that person who's like, okay, well, we all want things to look like this, or that consistency piece. What happens when they leave? And if they haven't done a good job of documenting what they have, how they arrived at those decisions, and how to use them, it's not enough to just have a spec to say, here's what we have. How do we get there, and how does somebody use it, are equally important. Because let's say that person leaves and then the team's like, wow, why do we need to do this thing? And if it's not been indicated, like, we need to have this metadata value because it serves this piece, this function in delivery, and we considered these other options, and here's why we didn't go with them, and at the time, well, then as things evolve, they may stop setting that metadata value, not understanding that it's going to impact delivery, Or maybe the delivery requirements change and they need to come back and say, oh, well, we didn't take option B before, but now it seems like option B might be the better one. And they don't have to start over again.
Right.
So again, it's not just enough to have done it, but you have to explain how you got there and then why people should care. What's in it for me as the author? Why do I need to set this value? Because anything that's not around the synthesizing of content, the ideas and expressing them for your audience, anything that's beyond that, like metadata values, for instance, can feel like overhead for an author and a distraction and one more thing that they have to do. And so unless it is super clear for them about the importance of it, or even better yet, they don't have to do it, that there's a way for that information to be imparted to the downstream systems that the author does not have to do, that's ideal. But we have to make sure people understand the why of what they do, because if they don't, there's just little motivation for many people to do that.
Yeah, definitely. I've seen a lot of people who don't appreciate the value of a really good, strong metadata description, or, good keywords and key tags, and structure overall, consistent structure across different types of documentation.
And you're doing everybody a disservice if you don't articulate the value, because we're all under a lot of pressure. We have a lot of things to do, and we should only be doing the most valuable activities for our organizations. And if we can't articulate why architecture is important, then we probably aren't doing it right.
All right. So tell me about the different roles in information architecture, and does it differ from like a larger organization with really heavy documentation, and a smaller one with kind of even less documentation?
Yes and no. So the easy answer is, there are three roles that I think of as the triumvirate that we care about in the architecture space. The first is the content strategist. The content strategist is setting the vision for success. So one joke that I have is, if somebody said, I need an airtight ship, well, that person in the role of the content strategist is saying, well, I need this. Well, airtight ship, am I going to the moon or am I going to the bottom of the ocean? Because that airtight ship would be made of radically different materials based upon what it's going to be used to accomplish and who's going to be using it, etc. And so the content strategist is the role that is working with marketing and user experience, and working with the folks that ideally are using the content to understand what they need, under what context do they need it, and they're able to articulate the requirements to the what I refer to as the management information architect. And I make a separation between a management information architect and a delivery information architect. And the reason I make that distinction is because if you type in information architect or information architecture in a search engine or a browser, 90% of what comes back is going to be talking about websites and user experience and how folks access and experience the content. And that is super important. And it's appropriate that the majority of that information will be out there, because if you think about an organization that is using a single source of content, but they have multiple delivery contexts, well, each one of those contexts would have a delivery architect responsible for, oh, well, here's the navigation, here's what metadata we need. But if you only have a single source of content, well, then maybe you only need one management information architect. And so, and to me, that's not only in an XML space. If you're thinking about how content is structured and thinking about what content should be reused, even if you're not in XML, that is still part of what I would consider the management architect's responsibility. And then, as I mentioned, the delivery architect is, working with the content strategist to say, oh, okay, so for this audience on their user journey, when they come to this context, whether it's an app, an LMS, you name it, where they experience the content, that needs to be a crafted, curated experience for them to have the right content at the right time, in the right language, etc. And so that it's a frictionless experience is what we want.
Yeah.
And you get that when those three roles work together.
It sounds like there's so much involved in information architecture that I don't think we give it the appreciation it deserves.
Well, I think that when you go to when I talk to someone not in the content space and they're like, what is information architecture? And I say, when you can go to a content experience, like, what was the last thing you went and looked up how to do? And they give me an example. And I say, well, how easy was it for you to find that information? And were you able to go and maybe within 3 clicks, be able to get what you need and then go back to what you were doing? And very often they go, oh, it was not 3 clicks. You're like, yeah, probably not. And that's because that architectural activity did not happen. It did not happen at the delivery end, potentially. It did not happen at the source end, or maybe even the strategy you had, maybe what they were asking for, they weren't a user that was meant to be supported by that context or that experience. And that is the easiest way to explain why architecture is important, because without that consideration and the planning, you don't get that great experience. Another way to think about it is, have you ever gone to a social event, like a wedding or a reunion or something, and you left going, wow, that was so much fun. I, as a guest, had a wonderful time. Well, if you did, they didn't just plan that yesterday.
Yeah.
They took time to think, oh, okay, if you're an out-of-town guest, we want to make sure that you have a place to stay. And every part of that experience is planned. That user journey, if you're a guest at an event, has been planned for you. Why would we expect that the experience that our guests have with our content does not deserve the same attention?
Yeah.
And yet we do. We just think magic happens.
Especially on the after they become a customer side of things, because I think we put a little more attention into the experience and things when we're from a marketing perspective and trying to win a customer. But then once we get them, we just think, just throw a couple guides at them, throw up a help thing, and they'll be fine, right?
It's what it never ceases to surprise me, because in theory, it should be easier to have a repeat sale from a happy customer than it is to go and convince somebody new to take the chance on you.
Yeah.
So that continuity of that user journey coming from the marketing and the content strategy space, I understand why an organization might bifurcate the activities to the pre-purchase and then the post-purchase experience. But it shouldn't just fall off a cliff once they charge their credit card, right? There should be a continuous experience. And because if you don't, what happens is you end up with shelfware. And I understand that for some companies, they're just like, well, we got the money, but that's really short-sighted way of doing business. Because if you have happy clients that are engaged and they're using the tool, they see the value of it, let's say software, then, when your competitor comes knocking, they're just going to be like, go away. We're happy. We are using the tool. It's meeting our needs. We understand how it meets our needs. And granted, there's other parts of this, but you could have a tool that does all those things. And if it never got implemented or people don't know how to use it, when that competitor comes knocking, they're going to listen.
Yeah.
And that means that, that you're going to potentially lose that license revenue, and that full length user journey, where we ideally have it, they buy something, it meets their needs. They are so successful that when they have a new need, they come back to us. It should be a continuous loop, not a to B, journey where at the end of it, they're gone.
Yeah.
Because we aren't adding the right value as an organization, I might say.
Yeah.
Not just as architecture, and again, content strategy gives us the journey. Management architect and delivery architect work to make it happen so that the user feels that full journey support.
Yeah. Okay. Makes sense. Okay. So structured content. Love
Mm.
this topic. I mean, this is what our podcast is about lately, is the ideas of structured content. Do you need to have that information architecture in place for structured content to really work, or is it vice versa, or are they kind of
I think
symbiotic?
it's symbiotic. Because if you think about what structured content is, and again, I will take a moment to define what I think it is, because again, I think when people use the term structured content, it can mean a number of different things to a number of different people.
Yeah.
So for me, structured content is any content that is organized into modular components based upon their purpose. Notice I did not say XML in there.
Yeah.
There has been structured content in Word for, you can have you can have incredibly structured, consistent modular content as long as you understand the purpose of the modules and then the patterns by which you bring them together. That is exactly what architecture is. And so I don't believe that you can have structured content without architecture. They just are symbiotic. How do you know what module to create if you don't have an architecture to say, oh, is that a concept? Is that a task? Is that a reference? Is that a process? Is that a glossary term? What is the purpose of that information? And then I like to take it down to another level, which is, so maybe you have conceptual content. Is it background? Is it explaining a new concept? Or, I work with some folks in regulated industries. We aren't using, some of the more traditional types. They have their own architectures where they have an external requirement coming in from a third party. Maybe it's a requirement. And we'd have a unit called requirement. And then there's a relationship to the content that the organization has, which is the policy that shows compliance to the requirement. And they need to have those two pieces, and then the association, so that they can show to regulators how they will comply with all the regulations that are in their industry. That has nothing to do with a DTD. It has nothing to do with the source. It's understanding that you have two disparate units of content that have very specific purposes. They'll have very specific structures. They'll have very specific metadata. And there is a one-way, a unidirectional relationship between them. And I can tell you that if you're in a regulated industry, you have that architecture. You may not have thought about it the way I just explained it, but you have it, because when a regulator says, how do you comply? And you give them a list of your policies and a list of the requirements, that's how you got there.
Yeah. So they just don't understand that that's what they're doing.
Because it's just baked in. It's just been baked in. It's not been thought of as a separate discipline. And that's fine as long as what you have meets your needs.
Yeah.
And to me, I really like to take things to that next, just one more level to say, is it like people can say, well, it's just a concept. Are you giving me background? Are you introducing me to something new? Because then I might want different metadata on it. Or if I'm introducing somebody to something new, perhaps I'm always going to say it's a recommendation to have a graphic, some type of image, because images, there's a reason it says picture's worth 1,000 words, right? That people learn things differently. And if I know that the module is meant to be introducing someone to a new concept, then the template that I would provide for them to author it would by default have an image opportunity in it. Like, okay, here's where you put your graphic. That, if it were a background thing, I probably wouldn't. And that way we can help, again, remember I said that third part is how the authors use the architecture. You can have a beautiful, sophisticated architecture that if authors cannot use or do not know how to use, then you just wasted your time.
Yeah.
And you aren't helping them, because that's who, we talk about architecture and the benefits to the end user. But I honestly think that the first people architects serve are the authors. How do I know what content do I need to create? Well, there's patterns there based upon what we're trying to describe.
That's actually a really good point, that it's meant for both groups of people. And
You can't serve an end user if you don't serve the authors, because architecture is only experienced through content that somebody else writes.
yeah.
And so if you haven't designed something that is clear for the author to know, when do I need to create this new type of content? How did the pieces come together? Then they're just going to do the best they can, because that's what we do, right? When we don't have guidance, or we ask the person next to us, or we chat with them on whatever messaging platform you're using. So, hey, when you do this, are you? Or my other favorite is, we see a pattern that somebody else used that looked pretty successful, and we just copy it with no understanding of the intent, that their intent might be different than our intent or what we're trying to communicate. But in the vacuum of guidance, I'm doing the best I can. And so, again, I cannot emphasize enough how much, whatever your architecture is, that it support the people who encounter it first. And that is the people who create that content. And remember, you asked, how important is it by organization size? Well, I don't care if there's 2 writers or 1,000 writers. You need to be in sync, right? Because, I'll be honest, I'm writing, and over time, I'll notice I have drift in my writing. Like, my thoughts on things will evolve. That's just me, one person. And I'm more cognizant about this stuff than many, because it's my job. And I still don't remain consistent over time. So just think about exponentially how much more important that the conversations and the buy-in and the co-development of the architecture are with the people who use it. And in small groups, quite honestly, it's just a role. There might be one person who's responsible for keeping the style guide up to date, but the whole team might sit down and go, okay, yeah, I'm doing it differently. Let's come up with a guideline. That might be all you need if there's 5 people or less. As soon as you start to get into larger groups, or you have content, for instance, coming in from different business units with slightly different requirements, then you're going to need to have someone with more dedicated time, perhaps somebody from, again, performing a role from each of those organizations. And then there's a threshold where, based on the complexity, particularly when you start getting into reuse, if you're implementing an XML architecture, you want to do an AI initiative that has dependencies on architecture, it cannot just be democracy anymore. There has to be a point person. And again, it's not a choice between democracy and dictatorship. Don't get me wrong here. It's not like, the architect comes in and waves a wand and say, modularize. That is not how that works, right? Again, but we want to be cognizant of the tipping point when you need someone who has the responsibility as well as the authority kind of thing. So if you're familiar with RACI diagrams, responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed, you're going to always need somebody who is accountable for making sure that style guide is updated or whatever. There's a tipping point when the group gets large enough, or the technical dependencies become significant enough, that you're going to want to have a dedicated role for responsible. And so you would move into that last category.
So is that where you talk about IA maturity models? Is that where this all comes into play? How you define
very much so. And so I co-authored the DITA maturity model with Michael Priestley. And so that's specific to the Darwin Information Typing Architecture, which is an XML standard from Oasis. And we put together a maturity model that was 6 layers. And so when I go in and I'm working with a client that wants to implement DITA or has DITA and it's not meeting their business goals, or actually one of the most common is that there's been an acquisition. And so either they're being acquired or they've acquired someone else, and they need to harmonize or reconcile these disparate architectures. And it's an opportunity to give that refresh and go, okay, you're at level 2, which might be, which is reuse, scalable reuse. Now you're going to go up to level 4, and you're all going to pile into a content management system together. Well, before you all just pile in, why don't we determine what should actually go in there, what it should look like when it's in there, and how that relates to how you build your modular content using this particular architecture. And so having a maturity model is a great way to center or focus a discussion so that folks can articulate, particularly folks that are not content specialists, to be able to articulate what it is they need the content to accomplish. And so, for instance, the DITA maturity model, we have here's the investment and here's what you get out of it. Here's the return. Because that's the way that business stakeholders think about decisions on where they're going to invest money. And as one can imagine, the further up the maturity model you go, the more financial and technological investment is required.
Yeah. The DITA maturity model, is that like, I mean, it's an XML model, but it's a very specific
Yes,
one.
very specific to that standard.
And is it like the most popular model today? And
I think it really depends. I mean, in terms of DITA adoption, I don't know of another one that's out there for DITA. And quite candidly, if you're a group and you're saying, oh, wow, it sounds like we need to perhaps pay more attention to our architecture, look around for models. And if there isn't one that serves you, which I'd be shocked at because there's a number of them out there, there's content maturity, that's not specific to architecture, but there's a number of, if you type in maturity model and content maturity model, I can guarantee you'll get more hits than probably you would want. And so it's helpful if you already have a modifier on there. And is it the DITA maturity model? Are you looking to implement a different architecture? Let's say you're in the defense area, and so you have to implement S1000D. There are models out there for implementing S1000D. And what I like about a model is that it gives you a way to speak the same language with your business people, because one of the things that I think we fail on a lot as content professionals is we forget that the rest of the world doesn't use the same terms we do the same way we do. We just forget about that. We're very contextual, and we swim in our little ocean that we do, and then we go out and then we'll use words that either have no meaning for the business folks or they don't have the same meaning. And that's where we can end up with the misalignment of expectations and all the results of that. And I think that a lot of groups really struggle because we understand content's important, or we wouldn't be dedicating our lives and our professions to it, right?
Yeah.
But if you're an executive and your mission is to have a profitable business, and you're relying on working with marketing and all these other folks, and the content people come in and they cannot, which the irony here is we're professional communicators and we fail to communicate the value of what we build. We just don't do it that well for some reason. And that's, again, we're a great content strategist. That to me is one of the primary requirements for a content strategist is you have to speak business to content translation. Because you have to be able to translate it. And again, if you don't have maybe a content strategist, or you're newer in the profession, first of all, there's a lot of great resources out there for you. But a model can say, okay, I'm hearing that the business needs to accomplish this, here's then what we need to consider for investment, because I can tell you that every executive is always shocked at how much it costs to produce good content.
Yeah.
I just think it's words, right? How hard can words be? Right?
Yeah. And I assume that there are a lot of benefits for organizations to move up the maturity model level, right?
Yeah, you should only do it if you have a business need. I mean, I've seen some folks have some really over-engineered content for what their stakeholders need. I've also seen equally or more folks that have not given enough thought to it and are not necessarily serving their folks as well as they could. And again, it starts with, first of all, recognizing that architecture and content strategy are actually disciplines that you need to pay attention to, and that they have importance to things that can be measured. Number of sales, number of tech support calls, number of folks that leave the content portal without actually reading anything. There's all kinds of things out there that we can measure now that can be mapped back to what we do in this space. And, particularly in the larger groups, a lot of times we get separated into, for instance, when I worked at IBM, I was an important individual contributor of 325,000 people, right? And one of the things that we didn't understand was how our what we considered improvement every version to the content was costing the company in terms of translation costs, because it wasn't something that was surfaced in our group. And so in addition to the user journey being connected, the content journey also needs to be connected. Somebody needs to be paying attention to the investment. And I prefer to think of it as investment than cost, because if it's investment, you're getting a return for it. If it's cost, it's not necessarily going to give you a return. And I firmly believe that if you're going to spend money on something, you better get a return, particularly if it's content. Yeah. And sitting down and saying, okay, what does it cost to have a plan, instead of just sitting down and going, particularly in agile environments, it sometimes feels like someone just, shoots off the starting gun and then we all just start running and then like, okay, you're done. Notice I didn't say we're finished. We're done. We ran out of time. We ship what we have, and then we do it all again. And that type of content is not going to be consistent. It's not going to necessarily serve the user. It's not going to be modular potentially enough or have the right metadata to serve the delivery experiences that you want. And unless you take a moment, take the step back and say, okay, we have the user journey. What's the content journey? Oh, what's our architecture? Where could we reuse things? Where can we not? How do we handle content that serves multiple audiences? Is that with a metadata value? Or do we just continue to copy and paste? And then when the update cycle comes along, it's like a Pokemon game where you're trying to catch them all. And quite frankly, you never do, right? Yeah. Because the copy and paste just proliferates. And so I really like to say, okay, content starts here. And if you're in an agile environment, I always encourage that the first sprint, when everyone else is doing their planning, you should plan too. But it shouldn't start with, oh, we're going to do a documentation plan. It should start with, what's the content strategy? Why are we producing this, whatever this thing is that this is going to be for? And then laying it out with intentionality and being realistic about what we can and cannot get done and do a good job on it.
Yeah.
And I know folks are probably going, oh, that's not my organization. It's not most organizations, but unless you start the conversation and start with, can we be more intentional? They're really intentional about the code. They're really intentional about the testing. Why would we not be really intentional about the content that supports it and how actually people use that product that people are creating?
Yeah, it's kind of surprising, isn't it, that they don't really look at it that way?
Not necessarily, particularly if it's in high tech. You think about who runs high tech companies, and it's usually people who are coming from the engineering space. And well, they just think of the thing as their code and nothing more. Whereas if you talk to a client or customer, they perceive it to be that thing in a larger ecosystem. And that's where your marketing folks and your content strategy folks and UX folks need to be stepping up. And they can be also a great sense of, collaborators for you in your content space to start changing that conversation. It might be a little work to go find them. They might be in other organizations, but take the time, and start the conversation. You might not change everything all at once, because probably you shouldn't, but we're looking for constant progress. Don't measure for perfection, look for progress. Are we doing better every time? And define what doing better looks like. Are we more organized? Is it more, consistent? What does doing better mean? And that's where the strategy statement comes into play.
Great points. Okay. All right. Let's talk the AI story now, because you mentioned it up front, and we need to kind of get into that. What is the impact of generative AI on information architecture now?
So first of all, you went to one flavor of AI, And so you went with the generative. So one of the things that I think has finally become apparent over the last, I'm going to say 18 months, is that AI is not one thing. And depending on who you talk to, there's 6 or 8 different flavors of AI. And that I'm sure that there will be holy wars about that for the next 20 years until it tells us what it is, and then we're done. So, but until we get there, I tend to break down IA into some maybe not as specific as an AI specialist maybe would categories, but I tend to think about AI that can help authors. And I think about it in 2 contexts. One is first draft faster.
Mhm.
How can I use AI to get to that first draft so that then I can really bring my expertise to bear and making sure that it is the right piece of content with the right purpose, with the right words and technically accurate and all that stuff. And then the next flavor is second draft better. So there are times when you can use AI. So one of the more common use cases is that if you're in DITA and let's say you've written the task, instead of having to sit there and sweat like, oh, what should the short description be? Using AI to go through and it can look at the steps and go, oh, and it can draft that short description paragraph for you. And for teams that I know who have done this, they have found that to be a significant time saver because they're not trying to come up with that 2 to 3 sentence description themselves. It's easier for them to edit what's there, and then they can be done. And some key teams are reporting like an 80% like good, like that draft is what they went through. And that depends, of course, on your training and all that other stuff. Second draft faster. Sometimes you have to be the person who writes it. And I think of the example of the second draft faster is when you have content and you're in an authoring tool that has AI built in that actually activates, for lack of a better word, the style guide, and they can go through and you can focus on, okay, I need to get this technical piece of information right. When I was an author, I did geek to geek translations. I worked for software companies that produced software for other developers. So when I was doing geek to geek translation, I really was struggling in trying to really synthesize that technical information. And then remembering what the marketing buzzword of the day for our company name or product name was not my skill. And so it would have been great if, what they have now in a lot of these authoring tools is it's like, okay, take what I have and run it through and evaluate it. And it's like, no, that's not the right name. Just, and suggesting, and again, second draft better, right? I did my part, the part that the human can do. And then rather than me sitting there and spending time trying to figure out what is in the style guide, having that baked into the tools, that's a wonderful use of AI. And at that point, also AI can be used, for instance, if you're in an XML architecture, to be able to say, oh, are you using the appropriate elements? And that keys off to, okay, if we have the appropriate elements, then let's say if it goes through to the other side, the information is published. And a lot of AI implementations started out by running against, a bunch of PDFs or a bunch of Word files or things like that they don't have any semantics in them anymore. They literally just see what's there. And now many of the implementations are saying, oh, if you have content that's in XML, don't render it into a PDF for us. Send us the XML because the XML provides semantics. So for instance, if you have a chatbot and somebody types in, what do I need to do before I can start X task? Well, if you, for instance, were in DITA and that X task was a topic and you had used the prerequisites element, AI doesn't need to spend tons of time being trained. It would be, oh, I will deliver whatever is in prerequisites because the semantics have already told me what it was. Yeah. And so in that case, the semantics and the structure help the author know, okay, before you can start step 1, don't forget you have to do X and give me a place to put it. If we keep those elements or the identifiers through and send it to the output for the AI or wherever your AI is sitting, because it can be sitting all kinds of places, and it can retain that it will give you more consistency than if the AI has to go through and hunt for every task that applies to what you're trying to accomplish, and then trying to figure out, based upon words or positions or whatever the algorithms are, what the prerequisite was. If it's already labeled, it's consistent and it's faster, and it can help a lot with the training and things like that. So those are just a few examples of AI. And like I said, there's wonderful podcasts out there from all kinds of folks around other examples about how structured content can be used. And again, there's metadata and all kinds of other ways that we can help with the training. We can help with the consistency and clarity of the responses. And for me, one of the big challenges as an architect is, before AI, the advent of what we currently have as AI, let's be honest, AI has been around for a long time. Think Watson, right? Is the metadata challenge. When I think about having P units of content and having metadata on them that goes along with them, that allows them to be presented at any point in time in the life cycle of wherever they need to be. One of the challenges is, how do we apply and then maintain? The maintain is the hard part, the metadata on each of those pieces of content. And before we were reliant on things like taxonomies and ontologies in order to get relationships to other pieces of metadata. Now, with knowledge graphs and AI being able to develop things like this on the fly, it's exponentially opened up the potential power on delivery and findability of content, but only if it's been trained. And the best way to train information or these AI models is on structured content, because again, consistent, repeatable patterns is the best way that anything gets trained, whether it's a human or an AI. We learn better when it is consistent and repeatable. And that's what structured content at its foundation, that's what it gives us.
Yeah. And does that mean that taxonomies and ontologies may slowly go away, or are there still going to be a need for those?
I think that there are, particularly for for companies where you have to have regulated terminology, that you're always going to have that foundation, the taxonomy and the ontology. I think that the generation of knowledge graphs will become, it has become so much less labor intensive. But, I'll take a quick step back. There's some wonderful maturity models out there. Michael Antosca has one for intelligent, semantically identified content. We can put the link in the notes. But it starts off with definitions. You have to have a term and a definition. And one of the jokes that it's not a joke, it's the truth. But at IBM, we spent months to get from 19 versions of the word component down to 12 versions of the word component. And we still needed all 12 of them. And so just think, at the very first level, we had 12 possible meanings of the word component that were valid in very specific contexts. And then that context was identified based upon, as you keep going up, until, the taxonomy, the ontology, etc. And so where you would have a knowledge graph potentially for each context that would drill all the way back down to that one glossary definition. So I don't believe that AI in the near future is going to take away the place where we add our value. We're defining what we mean in a context, and then we're saying, okay, when component means X, then it's part of this classification. That classification has relationships to these other classifications. And then as you go up, and that higher level is where humans falter, because it's economy of scale. But AI is amazing. It helps us bring those things together and apply them. Because in my world, I only want anyone, and I hope it's not the author, but if it has to be, I don't want the author to have to specify any more than 3 pieces of metadata. And ideally, it wouldn't even be a selection. They'd select a template and it would be there for them. They don't even have to know it's there. But then the downstream systems in your content development operations would be leveraging all the power of the glossaries, the taxonomies, the ontologies, the knowledge graphs, and everything else that AI is now bringing to the table to get all the power that we need for delivery without it having to be manual work for a person, because that's not where we excel. We should be doing the work that is value added, because we are humans and we have brains and we have experience, And that higher level association that is changing by the minute is not something that we as humans are probably ever going to be great at. And there might be a few humans, but not many of us.
Yeah. Okay. Lots of stuff to think about. And AI is kind of really helping us in a lot of ways that are, if we use it the right way, it's really beneficial.
And I do want to say one other thing about this is that no executive wants to be known as the executive who didn't invest in AI. So there is now money or funding opportunities for content initiatives that if you can show how what you are trying to accomplish benefits the end user utilizing an AI initiative, then you have a much better, again, that's speaking their language. They're all like, AI, that's super cool. If we're hearing all about it, we need to invest in this. Well, make sure they're investing in what will really help the consumers, not just the cool, sexy thing that some vendor walked in the door with.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, this has been a really, really good conversation. I have one last question that I'd like to kind of leave with, and that is, what are kind of, in your opinion, the top 2 to 3 skills or mindsets that a successful information architect needs to have when they're doing technical documentation? Like what advice would you give someone who is really interested in getting trained to do this stuff?
Well, the first thing is that you need to be a pattern hunter because we're looking to find the patterns and harmonize them into, repeatable patterns that other people can use. If you can't spot patterns, you're probably not going to be successful at that. So if that's not something that you enjoy, then the IA track is probably not a good track for you. I also think that you have to be able to make connections that that are not maybe immediately apparent to other people, because remember, remember the art and science. You're interpreting okay, here's what we need to do, and you have to interpret. Okay, well, they need that, and we have this, and they need that, and then when I harmonize that all together, and I have this tool set, what can I bring together to the art part of it to meet the business need? And so I think that there's an amount of creativity necessary, because people are like, well, we're just going to adopt DITA, or we're going to adopt S1000D or whatever. They have thousands of elements in them. No group uses all of them, and they don't even necessarily use them the same way. And so you need to be able to interpret and to take in these multiple and sometimes very disparate and even contradictory seeming requirements, and be able to build something that works. They're not asking you for why it doesn't work. They're asking you to build something that works and works over and over and over again for millions potentially of pieces of content. And that in some industries will be around for 30 years, right?
Yeah.
So and if you want more information about this, if you go to the DITA Strategies website, on our media section, we have some job role descriptions that are we like to recommend for folks that if you don't have these roles already as an identified role, start with this and just say, does that seem like it's applicable or not? They're not like you must have all of these. It's a guideline to get the conversation started around, wow, what is it that we need at this point in our organization, and over the next 12 to 18 months will we need? Because you don't want to be building an organization for what's happening right now, because if you do that, then you're always going to be behind. The goal is to be looking forward based upon the company's goals, and being able to see that vision to say, okay, at what point do we need to have these skills or this support in place? And then look and say, oh, is it one person that does all these roles? And in some small groups that is it that it's a person in our group, but maybe the content strategist role is being played by someone over in, or performed by someone over in marketing, and just working with what you have. Because I can tell you that just going and saying, we need to have these roles, management's going to be like, yeah, no, you got to prove it, the value. And like I said from the very beginning, you probably already have them. You just didn't identify them. And so, like, if you don't recognize that you have information architecture, you probably don't know that you have information architects, and you do, or you wouldn't have contact.
Yeah, so true. Thank you, Amber. It's a really great conversation. There's probably like a million other questions we could kind of go through and talk about, especially around DITA and stuff. But we're running out of time.
Yeah, totally. But I encourage folks to go to DITAstrategies.com and look at the resources we have available. And I'm also just going to mention, I have recently started another company, and it's called Board Leopard, and it's an ADHD advocacy company. I was diagnosed 3 years ago with ADHD, and that knowledge has just changed my life. And I want other folks who may not know why their sparky brain doesn't seem to perform the way other people's brains do, to understand that it's not a bad thing. And so if you have, we'll put the link in the information. Yeah, I know it's a bit of a tangent, but if you're that person and you want to know more about ADHD and particularly for adults, come visit us. We're looking to help other folks. I'm not a medical professional, but I'm sharing my journey and why it's been just such a great thing for me to understand. I felt like I was trying to, I was getting judged on being able to cut with scissors with my right hand and didn't know I was left-handed. And now I have left-handed scissors, and oh my gosh, I can cut much better.
No, that's great. That's great. I will definitely make sure we have that website link on the show notes as well.
But thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about what I love to talk about, obviously. And we hope that folks follow us, follow us on LinkedIn, get our newsletter. We'll be at LavaCon in the fall speaking. So please stay in touch, send us, questions that if there are things that you'd like to know more about, maybe Barb would be willing to have me come back.
Yep, definitely. All right.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. Before we go, I just want to thank our sponsor, which is Ingenix, and Discover CX by Ingenix is built for teams that need to deliver customer portals, help docs, and customer success sites. Helps you, structure content, write once, reuse everywhere, publish to any channel that has built-in XML authoring, AI, a customer portal, headless content delivery. It's got all that kind of stuff you need to do a modern customer experience. So you can check out ingenix.com, which is the parent company, or discovercx.com to learn more about that platform itself. Don't forget to sign up for our newsletter. We will keep you up to date on new podcast episodes. We do lots of kind of resources on the great guests that we have and the information that they provide us. So I definitely think you should sign up. That's been really good, great information. So thank you everyone for listening today. I'm glad that you were with us, and thank you, Amber. We're going to close it off for now.
Thanks. Have a great day.